Good morning. We are in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 today. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul was continuing to deal with some accusations made against him. Primarily the Judaizing teachers, meaning those who had come into Corinth after Paul had been there and brought the gospel to them, and they'd been converted to Christ. There were some who had come in and were teaching things concerning the law of Moses, and drawing some to go back to the old system, and making false accusations against Paul, questioning his credibility, questioning his authority, and so forth, and even describing him as what, to use a phrase that we use, as all bark and no bite. Talking about his letters are heavy, they're weighty, but when he's in person, he's very humble and timid, even with that kind of perspective. In fact, when we left off around verses 9 and 10 last time, I think he used a little bit of irony, maybe even sarcasm, you could say, in verse 9 there, that he says that I may not seem as if I would terrify you by letters. I think referring to the accusation earlier that his letters are very bold and heavy and straightforward, and he makes, I think, using that a little bit of irony concerning the accusations that have been made against him. We left off also in verse 10, for his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful, what we were just talking about, but his bodily presence is what? Is weak, and his speech contemptible. These weighty letters, something that is oppressive, something painful, as they're making this accusation against him, or rather even powerful, as he says, very, very robust and firm and so forth. But his presence, in great contrast to that, when he's there in person, he's weak, he's sickly, timid is the idea. Of course, that wasn't Paul at all, but these are the accusations being made against him. And in his speech, contemptible. It's nothing. It's weak. Paul's being slandered. False accusations being made against him. And he's having to deal with this, trying to defend his own apostleship, defend the authority that's been given him directly by God as an apostle of Jesus Christ, and the reality that he is who he claimed to be, and he had brought them the true gospel, and they'd been drifting away from it. We left off there last week. What questions do you have up to that point? All right, let's begin reading at verse 11, and we'll just go down to the end of the chapter. 2 Corinthians 10, verse 11. Let such an one think this, that such as we are by word, inward, by letters, when we are absent, such will we be also indeed when we are present. For we dare not make ourselves of the number, or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves, but measuring themselves by themselves, and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. But we will not boast of things without our measure, but according to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed to us, a measure to reach even unto you. For we stretch not ourselves beyond our measure, as though we reach not unto you, for we are come as far as to you also in preaching the gospel of Christ, not boasting of things without our measure, that is, of other men's labors, but having hope, when your faith is increased, that we shall be enlarged by you according to our rule abundantly, to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's line of things made ready to our hand. But he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. For not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth. All right, we'll pause there and back up to the beginning of the reading there in verse 11. Essentially, Paul gives a warning based on the accusations that we just mentioned about his letters being weighty and powerful, but his presence with them is weak, his personal speech with them contemptible. Concerning that accusation, Paul gives a warning there in verse 11. He's not going to be inconsistent. He warns them that what they have in his letters, all these very straightforward rebukes and corrections, they're going to have the same thing when he comes in his bodily presence and he comes in person. He's not going to be inconsistent. Is that a threat? Well, I mean, maybe, but it's really a promise that because he told them if they don't make these corrections, he's going to come with a rod. I mean, some might look at that as a threat, but they needed to make corrections. And Paul's telling them, this isn't just something I'm writing to you. If you don't make the corrections, you're going to get the same thing when I come in person. They understood Paul's message. If they didn't, this accusation wouldn't have been made. If they didn't really understand what his point was, they wouldn't have said, "Oh, his words and letters are powerful." But they understood exactly what he was saying, and Paul's reminding them of that. They acknowledge that it's weighty and powerful, what he's writing to them. But instead of acknowledging the wrong, they tried to discredit Paul. Some of them. Now, we saw that there have been some changes that have been made. Paul acknowledged that. They'd already made some changes, and he credits them for that. But apparently, there were still some very serious issues that needed to be addressed, and Paul is there, and people are, especially those teaching going back to the old law, they're trying to discredit Paul. He's bluffing. He's all talk. He's all bark, no bite, and that sort of thing. Instead of focusing on the message, they're trying to focus on the perception of the messenger. Does that ever happen today? Happens a lot, doesn't it? They're trying to change people's perception of the messenger rather than focusing on the message that's being presented. Now, we could talk about that a lot in the world that we live today, both concerning the preaching of the gospel. That happens a lot, but it happens outside of that too, doesn't it? It's a very popular thing to do in politics. Try to discredit the person rather than paying attention to the message that he has or she has. And that happens a lot with, personal disputes, rather than just addressing, what the issue is. Attacks are made against the person rather than dealing with the real problem. Very common, and Paul's dealing with that. And a couple of passages that Paul made reference to this sort of thing. Let's take a moment and read a couple of passages. First of all, Philippians 1, verses 15 to 18. Philippians 1, verses 15 to 18. Excuse me.
Some indeed preach Christ, even of envy and strife, and some also of God's good will. The one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bones, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. What then, notwithstanding, every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and I will rejoice.
All right, so the connection I want to make there is, as Paul's describing, some people are preaching Christ for different reasons, with different attitudes and so forth. Don't focus on the person. Don't focus on the messenger. Are they preaching the truth? Focus on whether or not they're truly preaching what they're saying about Christ and the gospel is really true. One more passage that connects with this sort of thinking, this sort of mindset. Matthew 22, verses 2 and 3. Matthew 22, verses 2 and 3. Why wouldn't they come? Was it because of the messenger? I don't know. But sometimes there's that perspective. Don't focus on the messenger, focus on the message. And that's what Paul is getting to over here in 2 Corinthians 10 as well. They're making accusations against him. They recognize the message that he preached, but instead of focusing on that, and is this really the case? Is this really true of Christ and the gospel? They're trying to discredit the messenger. May we never be guilty of that sort of thing. Focus on the message and not whether or not we have personal problems with the messenger. Do we like the messenger or do we not like him, and is that going to change our view of the message? That's the wrong perspective to have. Questions, comments? They were being called in. Some would not come. Why wouldn't they come? Was it because they didn't like the messenger? They didn't like the one who was being called or the one who was calling them? Don't focus on the messenger is the point. What's the message?
Normally, when the truth is cutting, and this was so powerful, that they didn't have a comeback. So the only thing they had left was to talk about the person.
That's right. That's right.
So they didn't have no defense. You see all these words that were powerful. Present, you weak.
That happens a lot even today when, we can't argue what the person says, so let's attack the person. Paul's experiencing the same thing. Come back with me to 2 Corinthians 10 now. Got it. Verse 12. Excuse me. For we dare not make ourselves of the number or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves. We dare not. Some say we're not so bold as to do this. Paul's not going to put himself into the class and do the same things that are being done to him by some of these people in Corinth. He's kind of using some irony. We wouldn't be so bold as to compare ourselves with some of you. Using a little bit of irony again. But he's talking about those who commend themselves. Those who were accusing Paul and deceiving, they belong to a larger class of false teachers. Those who lift themselves up, recommend themselves while just trying to put other people down. Can't argue with the message that he's preaching, but trying to put the messenger down. A larger class of false teachers who lift themselves, recommend themselves over somebody else. Not because of the message. He's trying to lift up self. And he even says measuring, let's get the right wording here, but they measuring themselves by themselves. Well, whose standard are they using? Their own. Using their own standard to measure themselves, comparing themselves among themselves. And then what's he say about them in the last three words there? They are not wise. Well, if they're not wise, what must they be? Oh, that's foolish, isn't it? That's foolish to compare yourself with yourself, to measure yourself by your own standard. But do we make the same mistake sometimes? Measure ourselves by our own standard rather than by God's standard. And that's exactly the point. We can make that point of application several different ways, and that's one of the ways I was going to. You're exactly right. I'll come right back to it. And, well, that person's doing this, so that must make it okay for me. That just because somebody else is doing something doesn't make it right. That's oh yeah, yeah. Well, I'm certainly better than what that person is, right? So I must be pretty good. That's the wrong standard of measurement, Miss Janice. Yeah.
This, that, and the other, and the only thing this other one could say is, be merciful to me. This other one is boasting.
Lift himself up.
He is,
yeah.
That he's not like.
And I think it's also significant to remember who those people were. One had a Pharisee, right? Lifting himself up. But who was the other person in that count? You remember? A publican, a tax collector. Oh, he's hated. He's hated. But he had a very humble mindset, didn't he? But the Pharisee's lifting himself up and comparing himself with, I'm glad I'm not like this tax collector.
The other extreme is we can look at someone else and think that we're worthless and
That's true too.
give up on ourselves because we see someone else succeeding. That's the wrong type of outlook we should have. We should not be comparing.
Great point as well. Sometimes we see some very talented people in whatever realm in their ministry for the Lord, and we all should be part of a ministry for the Lord. What does the word ministry mean? Serving. We should all be serving the Lord. And sometimes we look at people, man, they're very talented. Look what they're able to do. I guess I'm just not worth anything. Well, no, that's not the right perspective. Great point, Clifton. We need to, rather than focusing on my shortcomings and what I cannot do, well, okay, what are some of my strengths? What can I do?
We have to be careful not to do that with our kids, because then they do grow up thinking that way. I can't compare to, Bill or Bob or whoever. I mean, I think as parents we have to be careful that we don't condition our children to do that as they grow up.
Great point. To use the skills that they have in the realm which they're able to serve. Now, every set of skills that we have may not. Doesn't mean we can use them any way we want in our service to the Lord, but we have abilities that we can use. Great point. I had jotted down here a note. Another way that I've seen this mindset used or misused, depending on how you're looking at that, comparing ourselves with ourselves. I've heard people talk about qualifications of elders, and people say, "Well, I know this fellow over here who's an elder. If he's qualified, is that how we measure qualifications for elders? No. God has given us a standard for the qualifications of elders, and we don't measure ourselves by ourselves or by another man and say, well, if that person's qualified, well, this other person must be too. No, that's not how we measure things. But these false accusers against Paul were boasting their own superiority to Paul. They're greater than Paul, but by whose standard? Their own. Well, how much is their own standard worth? Nothing. Not worth anything. But that's the standard that they're using. And that's what Paul is trying to expose and get the rest of the Corinthian brethren to recognize. Verse 13. But we will not boast of things without our measure. Paul, I'm not going to be guilty of what you're doing. But according to the measure of the rule which God had distributed to us, a measure to reach even unto you. Paul says, I'm not going to use my own measurement. I'm not going to use my own standard. Rather, I'm going to use God's standard, is his point. God gave a standard. And specifically, as Paul's describing this, God, what specifically was Paul's ministry assigned to him directly from deity. Well, where was he to go? Who was he to go to? To the Gentiles. Well, who are the Corinthians, primarily? They're Gentiles. Paul said, I've been given a role by God specifically to go to you. I'm not measuring myself by my own standard or deciding what I should be doing by myself. No, this is what God gave me to do. I'm within His realm, the sphere. And some translations use the word sphere for the word, I think King James uses rule, if I remember correctly. Let me go back and read it again. Let's see. Yeah, rule in the middle of verse 13. According to the rule which God has distributed to us, some translations use the word sphere, the realm in which God assigned me to work. Well, that word means standard or rule. The sphere in which God has assigned Paul. He had a task given directly by deity. And that's what he's going to carry out. But some of these brethren had gone into Corinth and tried to lift themselves up over Paul and what Paul had been assigned to do by God. Questions, comments? Verse 14, for we stretched not ourselves beyond our measure, as though we reached not unto you. For we are come as far as to you also in preaching the gospel of Christ. Not stretching ourselves or not extending ourselves. As I just said, Paul had a work of carrying the gospel to the Gentiles. And Paul says, I'm within what God assigned me to do. I'm not overextended. I'm not extending myself beyond where my authority is. This is what God gave me. Let's go read that real quick. Acts 26, verses 16 to 18. Acts 26, verses 16 to 18. Who's got it?
But rise and stand upon thy feet, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness both of these things which thou hast seen, and those things in thee which I will appear unto thee, delivering thee from the people and from the Gentiles, unto whom now I send thee, to open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan unto God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among them which are sanctified by faith that is in me.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Let's get a little bit of context there. Of course, this is Paul when he's before Agrippa, kind of rehearsing the events that happened to him concerning when the Lord appeared to him and when he had been converted to Christ. And now he describes what the Lord told him. And that's the part that Miss Janice just read for us. The Lord told him. What did he assign the Lord, Jesus, specifically assign? What did he assign Paul to do? Preach to the Gentiles. And that's what Paul is reminding the Corinthians of over here in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. The Lord gave me the authority, assigned to me the responsibility of going to the Gentiles. I'm not overextending where my authority is. The Lord told me to do this, authorized me to do that. He's not boasting, lifting himself up as one who has no authority. He's got authority directly from God. So he's not overreaching himself. Yet, false teachers had come in and kind of invaded the area where the Lord had assigned Paul to go. And now they're trying to discredit Paul. Trying to make the brethren in Corinth think less of Paul. Trying to gain that following that they desired. Questions, comments? Verse 15, not boasting of things without our measure, that is, of other men's labors, but having hope, when your faith is increased, that we shall be enlarged by you according to our rule abundantly. Not boasting of things without our measure. Again, same idea there. I'm not outside of my limits. I'm not outside of what God has authorized me to do. This is exactly what God has authorized me to do. He had a God-authorized work. And He desires that to see their faith increased, as he describes. Paul hopes that their faith will continue to be growing, and as a result, his work will be magnified. What does it mean to magnify? Well, to make larger, right? And he desires his work there to be made larger, expanded, to recognize the work that God assigned him to do and allow him to do even more. And of course, in that process, the Lord will be glorified. If his work for the Lord is glorified and magnified, well, the Lord is magnified. And you see that same word that we referenced earlier, the very end of verse 15, that we shall be enlarged or magnified by you according to our rule abundantly. That's the same word earlier. Some translations use the word sphere. The realm, the sphere, the area which God has assigned me to do. We're doing this by His authority. This is what He gave us to do. And He hopes that He'll have further opportunities to expand that even more, to be enlarged, to have more abundant work, more abundant labor in Corinth and beyond, which we'll reference in the next verse. To do even more for the cause of Christ. Speaking of, let's go right into the next verse. To preach the gospel in regions beyond you. So he doesn't have in mind just Corinth. Of course, he's already been a number of places, and both among the Jews and the Gentiles. He's been preaching in many different places, but he hopes to go beyond even where he's been in Corinth and other places. What other places might Paul have in mind at this point? What do you think? He talks about preaching the gospel beyond Corinth. Well, where did he have a desire to go but hadn't been yet? Rome, for one. In fact, let's go over to read Romans 15, verses 24 and 28. Now, we know that he eventually went to Rome, maybe not the way that he wanted to, because how did he end up going? As a prisoner. But let's read Romans 15, 24 and 28. We know that he went to Rome, but he also had plans and a desire to go somewhere else. Let's read it. Romans 15, 24 and 28.
Whensoever I take my journey into Spain, I will come to you, for I trust to see you in my journey, brought on my way thither by you, at first somewhat filled with your company. Yea, and therefore I have performed this, have sealed to them this fruit, I will come by you into Spain.
All right, thank you, sir. So maybe that's part of what Paul has in mind here when he says he wants to preach, yes, in Corinth and other, but beyond there as well. We know that he ended up going to Rome. I don't know if he ever made it to Spain, but we know that he did end up making it to Rome and preaching beyond Corinth in that way, certainly. Now, in the second half of verse 16 there, and not to boast in another man's line of things made ready at our hand. Here's some of the difference between Paul and Paul's false accusers. Paul had been there in Corinth. He had preached the gospel. He had converted many people to Christ. But now the false teachers were coming in and trying to steal what Paul had done. They're trying to take what Paul had done and make it their own. And not building upon it, Not building and expanding what Paul, not recognizing this is a great work that Paul started, and they're trying to steal it and make it their own and take them away from the truth. What a contrast in mindset between Paul and these who were opposing Paul and making false accusations against Paul and so forth. The one working, the one laboring, shouldn't be boasting in self, but boasting in the Lord. That reminds me of what we noted all the way back in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 6. What does that passage say? Who remembers? 1 Corinthians 3, verse 6. I guess we got to go read it. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 6. What's it say? All right. So rather than glorying in self, glory in the Lord, because who is it that's giving the increase? Well, it's the Lord. God gives the increase. But Paul said, I planted. Now, what did Apollos do? Was Paul upset with Apollos? No, he wasn't. They were a team. They were working. One was building upon another. What's the difference between the relationship of Paul and Apollos and what Paul's dealing with in Corinth now? They weren't continuing to build on what Paul started. They were trying to steal it away from the truth and make it their own based on things that weren't true. Taking people away from the gospel. So Paul had no problem with someone coming in after him and continuing the work there. That wasn't the problem at all. The problem was they were making false accusations against Paul, trying to discredit him and trying to pull people away from what he taught. Question?
Run into that these days. Have all these denominations.
Oh, it happens, of course. And there's a battle over souls, of course, all the time. But there's a big problem in some places. I don't want to go into details at the moment, but there's a big problem with competition even among brethren. People being jealous over different works that people are doing. We have some of that in the States, of course, but sometimes in other places it seems even to be an even bigger problem. Competition among brethren in the church because somebody's doing this type of work and I want to do that type of work too and that sort of thing. Competition among brethren. Well, are we in competition with each other? No. We're supposed to be working together for the cause of Christ, to get as many souls to heaven as we can. That's the ultimate goal. Yes. You're exactly right. This person doesn't do it in the way that I like. Okay? But let him work in the realm. As long as he's teaching the truth, that's what Paul's describing here too. Is he teaching the truth? Okay, let him. And you go about the work the way that you want to, as long as you're teaching the truth and a work that suits you and your skill set. And so, but don't argue with people over how they're going about the Lord's work as long as they're faithful. They're not going outside of the Word of God. Great point. But Paul's praising God, acknowledging that his work is in him. But these false teachers, those accusing Paul and trying to discredit Paul, they're praising themselves. And in the process, no doubt they'd be neglecting praise toward God and even working against the Lord. And that's verse 17, really. But he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. Quote from Isaiah 65. But don't glory in self, glory in the Lord. Don't leave off praising the Lord because you want to lift yourself up. And that's what these false accusers are doing. And it happens today too. anybody who leaves off from serving the Lord and teaching exactly what the Scriptures teach, well, that's what they're doing. They're lifting up self over the Lord. Here's what my opinion is about it, and lifting that up higher than what God has said. Last verse of the chapter here. For not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth. Now, keep all that in the context. Who's the one commended by the Lord in this context? Well, that'd be Paul. And that's been his point. They're trying to discredit Paul, trying to steal away the work that he's been doing. But he's the one authorized specifically by God to go in and do this. He's the one that's been preaching the gospel, the full gospel. And some have been coming in trying to lift up self over Paul and teaching things that were contrary to what Paul has taught, even though Paul's inspired. You think about how we know that Paul's the one who's approved here. Paul's the one who's commended by the Lord. You go back to, we made reference to Paul's recounting of it in Acts chapter 26, when Paul was before Agrippa and retold the story of how the Lord appeared to him and the instructions and so forth. You go back to Acts chapter 9 and you got the initial recording of that account, how the Lord called Paul for a specific work. The Lord assigned that to him. Paul was also inspired. You go back to what we covered a little while back in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 10. It was Paul who was inspired of God, revealing things from the mind of God, using words that we can understand. That's his revelation that had been given directly from God. He's inspired. So he's commended by the Lord. It also, what else could Paul do to confirm that he really was an apostle, that he really was teaching the truth? What else could he do? He could perform miracles. He had proven it over and over again that he is a true apostle, that he was assigned directly to this by God, and what he was speaking was God's message. He'd proven it over and over again. And not only could he perform miracles, but what else could he do with miracles? He could pass them, and many of the brethren in Corinth had miraculous gifts by the laying on of the Apostle Paul's hands. Yet now they're questioning Paul. How convincing must those false teachers have been? Sometimes I think about that. Paul had been with them, performed miracles, and given them miraculous gifts, but still some of them are being persuaded by other people and discrediting Paul. They must have been very convincing. Great point. And that reminds me of James 1. How does Satan, does he work the same for everybody? Does Satan tempt us on? No. By whose own lust? Our own. Our own. He uses our own desires, our own lust. And apparently maybe there were some in Corinth who had a desire to do their own thing and drift away from Paul. I don't know. But some of us happened. All right, good discussion. Lord willing, we'll pick up chapter 11 next time.